Welcome to the 29th Annual Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival. This season's theme, Indigeneities, celebrates the diversity of contemporary global Indigenous film and media art. This evening, we are pleased to present Rhayne Vermette, director of this week's feature film, St. Anne, in conversation with Josh Guilford. Rhayne Vermette was born in Notre Dame de Lourdes, Manitoba. It was while studying architecture at the University of Manitoba that she fell into the practices of image making and storytelling. Primarily self-taught, Rhayne's films are opulent collages of fiction, animation, documentary, reenactment, and divine interruption. St. Anne is her first feature narrative. Josh Guilford is assistant professor of English and Film and Media Studies at Amherst College. His writings have appeared in Alternative Projections, Experimental Film in Los Angeles, The Global 60s in Sound and Vision, Media Counterculture Revolt, and other publications. With Toby Lee, he is co-editor of a special dossier on documentary world making, published in the online journal World Records. I'd like to welcome you both to the Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival.
Thanks very much, Laura. Hi, Rhayne.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So I'm really happy to be here and to be in conversation with you. I really love your film. This is my first time kind of seeing it in the lead up to the festival. But yeah, I thought it might be interesting to start with light.
Okay.
To ask you a question about light.
Yeah.
I was really taken by the way like solar flares and light leaks and flash frames are working in this film. For people who aren't familiar with photochemical filmmaking, that's kind of, typically those occur when a kind of excessive amount of light floods the frame and kind of overexposes it. So it creates these kind of abstract fields of light that you might have seen throughout the screening. And typically, cinematographers try to prevent light leaks in all sorts of ways, but it felt to me like you and your cinematographers were kind of actively inviting light into the frame. Yeah, and so I'd be interested in knowing like how you did that technically, but I also am just kind of wondering what that light is doing and what it means to you.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with light. Like I was always, when I studied architecture, like all I was doing was like, unbeknownst to me, animating, but all it was like chasing light through like simple paper models. And I think light also plays like a huge role in these like incessant inner monologues I have about, light and the image and spirit / divine, presences. So yeah, so light kind of is in this like really kind of interesting place, important place in my practice. And especially like working with the bullets and stuff and the way that I'm working with light, there's something that happens to the images where it kind of like, to me, it seems like they kind of take over themselves and become something else outside of like my control or, so that's really interesting to me. So I kind of really when I am shooting or making something I'm open to kind of things coming in. And so, yeah, I literally, just was like, open the camera and flash the film or, St. Anne was low budget. So was using a lot of flash film and just kind of being open to the fact that there would be a quote unquote imperfection. I think St. Anne really embraces its imperfections. I think that's sort of something that I'm like, oh, good for you, St. Anne. But yeah, I just kind of am open to it. I'm open to like kind of interfering with whatever I think I'm chasing after. And it's just, yeah, fun to, when I'm shooting, I'm always sort of like overexposing, underexposing, and kind of like experimenting with like how something looks in both those realms and what that can kind of tell me. So it was just natural kind of, yeah, how St. Anne came, and then became a good way to sort of base my editing decisions and just like listen to what the light was telling me to do. So yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that it often felt like they were providing a way for you to transition, out of one shot and into another, but also I felt throughout this film like I was transitioning between different temporalities. It kind of took me a little while to figure out where where you wanted me to be, like, in time.
Yeah.
But I loved the way that those those flash frames were kind of providing this kind of a context for moving between these different spaces and times that you bring together in this film. Yeah, and I also came to feel like it's another way that the kind of landscape and the atmosphere and the environment is coming into the film. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, totally. Like, I think, looking back on it, sometimes I'm like, oh, it was a bit excessive, less might have been more, but that it directly draws from like this short film I had made, Les Chassis de Lourdes, which is like sort of about my parents' house where I like grew up, and my dad in the image, and kind of using, lights and light leaks as a way to sort of deconstruct the material house and kind of let ghosts, kind of seep out. So it's sort of, I think a lot of those decisions with Saint Anne kind of were reflections on sort of that film and what was sort of happening there.
Yeah, I mean, your trajectory is really interesting to me because you made these intensely kind of material and very kind of dense experimental works, and so the transition into a fiction feature, I think, is really, really interesting. And I'm personally very interested in when people who are kind of working more within a short film format and an experimental format transition into fiction. I mean, still obviously a very experimental fiction film, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about like what it was about fiction that felt exciting to you, or whether you felt like kind of working in that vein of narrative allowed or enabled you to kind of say things in different ways.
Yeah, I think like frankly what I've always been interested in is storytelling and how to tell a story. And I think that's, people will talk like, oh, architecture or whatever about my short films, but to me they're all about these like sort of ways to kind of like ignite storytelling and kind of like set it on fire or kind of deconstruct it, explode it. And yeah, I just felt like I'm sort of like was weird, interested in storytelling, but in kind of weird, kind of more internal, intimate storytelling in a way. So yeah, so all my short films have like a weird story to me, but it's kind of me like really compacting lots of narrative in sort of the images or the collages or the way they're constructed. Like a lot of my works were physical collages of other people's images, like kind of like a thief thing, and kind of carelessly and carefully, both at the same time, taping these films back together. So just in the tension of how I'm making my work, there's like a super kind of interesting narrative compacted in that. So it was always about this idea of storytelling, looping story, developing my own way of getting something across, working with symbols, working with simple things, working within my means to tell a story, and also fascinate myself. Like I'm very kind of selfish about my discipline, like it's for me, and I'm very, very straightforward about that, So yeah, so I've just made these films, and then I made my film Domus, which is like a short animated film that's sort of like this love letter to filmmaking and space and time, and it kind of like writes my life in a weird way. And so I kind of like, I don't know, I see it as such a perfect film, and I was just like, I think I'm ready, to just like get actors and kind of see what would happen. And it seemed like the only alternative to do after that film for me. So yeah, so then I started kind of thinking about script writing and how I can intercept that and so forth. And then, yeah, and then Saint Anne came out, which is, super weird, but super rooted into like my weird short films and animations. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I came across at some point a description where you were describing the film in terms of kind of allegory and symbolism, and was just kind of was really interested in how symbolism is operating. I mean, on the one hand, we get these very, I think, kind of very potent symbols like the wolf, the bull, which I would love to hear you unpack if you felt like it. But also just in terms of thinking about the characters, Renée, and even like the way domestic space is functioning in your film. I was wondering as I was watching it, am I supposed to be viewing these spaces metaphorically or allegorically? And so would just be really interested in hearing more about how that functioned or kind of figured in your production process, whether you were thinking about these kinds of connections, like this stands for this, right? That stands for that, or whether you were pursuing a different kind of approach.
I think I just, use like symbolism and metaphor as a way to suss out the details, and it's interesting because then the more I suss out the details, the more I take out of like the dialogue, or I take out, more of the overt story once I sort of start focusing in on the details. And what was fun about St. Anne was like the details was wardrobe and like sets and kind of land and, and so I just kind of packed in this, try in some way, pack in the story. Like the truck is super symbolic of my dad and like how we made the film. I was always in the truck with my dad. So, the leather jacket is like Howard Adams. I love this amazing, brilliant Métis philosopher, kind of a crazy bastard. So that was, and so, and like windows become kind of very symbolic and metaphorical, and started using those kind of ideas of, how to like anchor my story off the window and just like use the window as this like recurring character. And, the nuns obviously was a way of me kind of handling sort of historical context and folding it in, but like rather than kind of explain events or explain, colonization, it's just there and it's present in the everyday, but it's kind of presented in this other way. And same with the trains, there's this, the trains really signify the beginning of Canada, also signify, the Métis people or road allowance people. They were living kind of in between these sort of spaces that were designed for, the railway. So just having those things present. But kind of like, I'm always interested in like transcendence and kind of, different aspects of time and playing with different aspects of time. So how to have all these things kind of present in that frame, but in their own weird way. And and it gets more interesting that way. I'm not really explaining anything. I'm just sort of putting it all out there and kind of like watching it become its own thing. And I think that's the thing. I use like symbolisms and metaphor and as a means to like create my own world. And it's sort of like everything's sort of exploding in there, but it's all like heavily tied together, so the structure is pretty strong because it's all coming from like the same sort of place.
Yeah, it felt like a lot of things were signifying and that you were kind of putting them into play in like this kind of almost like I think you've described your work as a kind of a collage practice before.
Yeah.
And it's funny, the amount of times when I was watching and I suddenly had a realization, I'm looking through a window.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kept kind of recurring. And I thought that was really, quite kind of wonderful, actually, the way that it slips out of view, in and out of view, these kind of like, barriers or I guess transparent, kind of frames that we're looking through. But yeah, I mean, do you have is there a setting for this film? I mean, I know we have like a geographic setting, but is there like a time? Right, we don't see cell phones.
Sort of, yeah. Like I was thinking around the 1950s, sort of like when my parents were like kids. But it wasn't this thing that we were super locked into. Like we always said there was no continuity on set, but everything was always just continuous. And so that's like how we existed, it was just like, we just sort of really rolled with it. Yeah. but the site was sort of, early 1950s with potentially no, hydro in the main family home.
Yeah, I was trying to think of like what the most contemporary like technology that I saw in the film was. At some point you see flashlights, but then there's also a brownie camera in one shot that I thought was really interesting. And I mean, the presence of photographs in the mise en scène is really strong, a kind of anchoring, recurring object. And yeah, I don't know. It got me wondering. You talk a lot about this production process of this film, of you kind of driving around with your father and looking at the light in different spaces and making records of different spaces. But I was wondering about those photographs. Like, are those your photographs in the film? The family albums?
So there's some found photographs. There's some that are mine. There's, obviously the image of the bride is my mom. So yeah, so we just kind of like put it together. These books that kind of sort of kept changing, and the shot of the empty lot was a shot I went and like took. It was like a weird prop I had made. But yeah, I don't know. I like, to me, St. Anne is all about looking, and like that's why there's all these windows and sort of this idea of like looking and storytelling and the image, and how we like, we form ourselves around these images, whether it's like images we like make with our words or art or, in our minds and stuff. So yeah, I just kind of really wanted the image present. I'm really interested, again, like I said, about image making, and also thinking about my relationships. Like my grandfather, my dad's father, like I just have a photo of this man. That's all I really sort of know about this person who's like, important in my life. But that connection is through this image, and that's kind of sort of the closest sort of I had sort of felt with him when I was first presented. That image was kind of bringing this person into my realm. So yeah, so I think like all my films are sort of about image making, and even, you mentioned the bull, which comes from this like Métis folk tale that Francis Cree gives in the Métis Legacy, this like really amazing book that this like mentor of mine worked on. And there's this bull with these sort of golden horns, and sort of in the context of that story, like represents industrial farming, kind of agricultural, industrial kind of approaches. And it's not like, I don't think this figure is like, I think many other cultures sort of have this figure in their stories. But to me, like, that was like, because agriculture is a big thing in my life, and like my father, and kind of really paved sort of my father's trajectory in life. And so, Renee kind of facing that to me was like sort of facing that industrial image in a weird way, kind of like the power of that image and how it kind of defines things, and this wariness of it, I guess. Because like St. Anne really did come out of like also wanting to like find new ways to make film and tell stories that made, more sense to me as like a human being. Yeah.
That seems important.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that in terms of the kind of connection to industrial agriculture, but it's something that I was thinking about throughout the film, just because of the way you're shooting the land, and thinking about how landscape is functioning in this work, but land that doesn't seem, for the most part, to be land that is kind of an active agricultural site, and so it's particular places that you seem to have been drawn to, particular kinds of images of the land. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it means to you to film a landscape.
The film and landscape. Like I kind of was thinking about agriculture and kind of how like we associate with land, and all this kind of stuff, and really working at like building sort of this like collaged, again, idea of place through kind of across Manitoba, and kind of show some of the polarities that can sort of be found in that landscape. But a lot of these sites are also sort of sites of my youth. Like, interestingly, some of that, like, land that doesn't look agricultural is from my uncle's gravel pit, and that's an interesting site too, to me, and a site that's in the family. But yeah, like, I don't know, a lot of it just, again, came out of that process, like that backlighting process of like me and my dad and hanging out and trying to like think of these different sites, and then exploring them, and just kind of, yeah, going with sort of what worked out, what came out naturally. And we would then also revisit them and kind of, either me by myself or with the crew, and we would have these like long withstanding sort of weird relationships with these sites, and they would I would just sort of write them in, and was really sort of interested, yeah, in kind of like, land and storytelling and kind of the cyclical natures of land. Like, the film opens up with the site that my dad kind of closes the film on, and so thinking of these sort of relational kind of connections to land, yeah, just kind of really exploring it as a character and as like one of those symbols, as one of those metaphors, and again, like compacting everything into that. And you only see the city sort of once on the Arlington Bridge, and kind of sort of see the downtown, and we're kind of always I was really interested in kind of capturing this site that's sort of between rural and between the city, this indeterminate sort of wandering site. So yeah, that's just kind of did it with just all the visiting things over and over and over again. That's sort of how the film got made. Yeah.
Yeah, I started to wonder as I was watching some of that footage and hearing you talk about the process of shooting that, where you're kind of working in this very intimate way, just you and your father kind of driving around and watching the light and shooting. I was starting to wonder if there was a kind of diaristic component to those sequences. Like, if you look back on aspects or images of this film and think about them as a kind of record of the production process, or if there's any kind of element of this kind of like personal, like more kind of diaristic mode of filming to you, or if that's just totally off base.
I think it's like a record of people, like I think it is like a working record of like Métis, Franco, Manitoban people who are existing and around at this time, and a record of, talent which hasn't been recognized here in Manitoba, and often just like neglected, so I think about it that way. I think about it a record of engagement through the community and through everybody who like sort of put all their love into this, their love and prayers into this project. But yeah, everything sort of the chaos of it all, though, however, it just like sort of compounds into, because there was so much, and I was working on it all the time for so many years. It was like a crazy ocean to wade through a little bit. Yeah. But I always sort of, saw those more kind of intimate, diaristic sort of shoots that was just me and my dad, sort of like, and a lot of those were shot on Ektachrome, so they're more vibrant. But I kind of always saw those as sort of like Renée's POV, and sort of Renée's world in comparison to, and then that sort of starts interfering as the film goes along.
We've reached the time where we're supposed to start incorporating questions from the audience. Do you want to select a question that you might like to respond to, or would you like me to do it?
I don't know. I'll pick number 4 for now, so I just read that.
I'll just read it quickly. It says, dialogue in St. Anne seems so natural and flowing. Can you describe the writing process and note any of your favorite lines from the film?
So the writing process, again, was like a varied thing. Like, there was the writing process to sort of get some sort of sense of a script out in order to get like money. And so that was still sort of unconventional. It was like a lot of like fragmented sort of descriptions of scenes. So that I used that to sort of block my financing. And then sort of as soon as we started shooting with non-actors, I was like, this is not going to work. And kind of really took apart the script and took a lot of the dialogue out, and just like from then on, it was just naturally letting people be, who they were. So it was like, this is it, we're at this table, and then your cousin comes over, you guys haven't seen her in 4 years, like, how would you guys react, and like, how would you get her caught up, and and it also helped that a lot of the people on screen are my family, so that actually was my cousins, and then other of the non-actors, like Dolores Gosselin, who plays the grandmother role, like, I would just ask her to tell me stories, and then just use those stories in the film. And the big Christmas scene was natural because that's my godfather telling the joke, and I had just told him the punchline. That's all I told him. And so you're seeing us like actually react. Like, I had no idea that he had like made this like drawn out thing. And so that was the first time we were all hearing it, and he was vibing off of us and stuff like that. So that's how we got things sort of natural, especially as the big groups. It was just innately relationship and natural performances. Yeah.
It's a question here about hardships during the filming of the movie.
Sure.
And how you overcame obstacles that you encountered.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there was like, we were just so resilient. Like, actually, I think because we didn't start with like, this is what we are doing, this is what we have to achieve, this is the level. We didn't have any of those kind of ideas or notions in our head because we were always operating outside of the industry. Like, it was all just Arts Council money, super low budget. But because we had a low budget, we could kind of like operate outside of the rules. And so we just had this natural way of just time traveling, and just like shit would get done, and just kind of taking up space and kind of doing it our own way. And we were very adaptive, like, especially like when we first started shooting and I was really sort of looking at my script and really kind of fixed on what was on the page, the rushes came back and I had to can a lot of the stuff because the dialogue didn't really sell and it was just too, explainy and stuff like that. So then I just like, that's when I took a step back and rewrote and we slowed everything down. And so I think, we kept this like really great open-ended, hyper collaborative sort of way of working, which didn't really feel, there was obstacles, it was like, oh, this shot might not work in this way, but it was just like, okay, well, like, let's just like tape this and this and this and MacGyver or some shit. And like, and then it's like, and the shot comes in and the shot is all rocky and stuff. And it's like, okay, well, then we'll just add on this music. And, it kind of was just like whatever quote unquote failures, or it just kind of added more and was like an opportunity to like innovate. And I don't know. It was just, there wasn't really anything that was like, that there never was moments where it was like, this film is like ruining my life, or, we were just really thought that it was a sinking ship. It was always like, it was always doing all right,
That kind of maybe interfaces with another one of the questions from the chat, which is about your experience working with the Cousin Collective. You've talked about like the Arts Council, but it is described as being commissioned by Cousin Collective, right? What was that process like for you?
Cousin's awesome. So the bulk of my financing came from like various Canadian arts councils. So that was great, thank God for those arts councils. But I was trying sort of in the process, trying to like, apply to these weird, more industry things, even if it was just to get training and stuff, but it was never very successful. But with arts councils, it was like, I think they could see like, it was like really coming up against like traditional means of filmmaking and stuff. So it did well. But it was a struggle, and I was kind of like rounding out and kind of facing the edit, and there was like no money left and I needed a sound mix, and like the sound mix was so important. And then I just, saw this open call with Cousin, who were looking for sort of the work that I was doing, kind of just like more avant-garde, Indigenous kind of storytelling modes of kind of moving image or storytelling. so yeah, I just applied, and then yeah, they kind of chose St. Anne. I think there's like eight artists, like all these like amazing artists who I'm like super honored to have been part of that cycle. So it was great, you know. It was just Cousin was awesome. I was able to get a sound mix. I was during like a pandemic when I had like lost all my teaching jobs, and Cousin's also awesome, just like because they understand, they don't bog you with administration. You know, they're pretty hands-free. They sort of self-define for themselves what feels right and how to work with artists, which is like really admirable. And they also really kind of help get the word out. And sort of I think now I kind of have more connections in the States, especially through Cousin, and sort of them facilitating. Yeah, they're just amazing. Like the way that collective works, I think is like really powerful, and kind of a really great way of like thinking about sort of new modes of kind of getting films made or getting art made that is kind of more kind of in the hands of the people who actually really care or have a stake in the form, you know.
That sounds really amazing. I mean, it seems important just to mention that it's a collective of artists and producers, right? And so, filmmakers and people who have a lot of experience working within the film industry, or you know, outside the film industry, but working creatively.
Yeah.
This is maybe kind of going back to a different subject that we touched on a couple times, but it seems related just because somebody's mentioning the work of Sky Hopinka, who I believe is involved with Cousin.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just a question about notions of Indigenous times, and whether you can talk a little bit more about how time is functioning. I guess you could, you know, approach that in whatever way you want, but I was really amazed when I was watching the film about how difficult it was to kind of, as I think I mentioned earlier, to place myself within a kind of timeline. And I know that you've talked also about your interest in creating more kind of circular narrative structures and storytelling modes. And so, yeah, is that related to you, to modes of kind of Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, I think I'm still figuring out sort of my like how I see time, but I do know that I see it kind of experience it different or see it different, but I quite don't have words to really express it. And I think that's how I fell into filmmaking. Because when I was studying architecture, it was like material bodies and these material things, and I was like, that's how I started animating, was this really interesting way for me to like move between materiality and move between time, and then started kind of analog filmmaking, and then my physical relationship to time, you know, like sort of this is a second, and like wow, like it has a physical sort of, yeah, it enters my physical realm, and kind of time becomes, I don't know, completely skewed. And even down to the way that I animate, like animators, you know, often they'll animate like, is it like 12 frames a second or 24, but I don't do any of that. Like I kind of speed things up, slow them down, and I don't think about frames per second. And I've actually had a cognitive psychologist study my animations and how I make them, and she was like, she studies animators, and she was like, I've never seen anybody who sort of experiences or expresses time in this way. She literally is like, I think this is my life's work, you know. And so I sort of, yeah, kind of meeting with this person and sort of putting together sort of my history and the confrontations I found in architecture and stuff like that. I was like, oh yeah, I think there is something about time and me working in this time-based thing. And so St. Anne was sort of this other way of kind of working a little bit with time and working with like interconnections to like other events outside of yourself and outside of your own sort of generation, but sort of like water. Like I think a lot about the rivers and sort of really how I myself am sort of this sort of being who kind of is like this I'm always in movement, and that everything is always moving with me, and sort of even home isn't a fixed thing, like home is a moving thing. And that's, I think about the Métis Nation a lot as sort of this nation that was always in movement and was always kind of changing. And And even my dad, who's this character who's always in movement and kind of always, moving around Manitoba and kind of knows everybody and part of all these communities. So yeah, I don't really quite know exactly what it is, but like my idea of time is sort of forming itself around all of these things. And it's still like, it's a work in process, but I think that's why I like filmmaking, because I can like really like intercept time and kind of blow it up and kind of, I think that's like, to me, filmmaking is like a device for like seeing and me understanding my place. So it's, everything I make is sort of a device. Like every film is a sort of a device for me to crack into sort of this thing I'm curious about. And 100% like time is in it, but I don't quite know what it is yet. Yeah.
That's interesting. It makes me think of, there's like a line. I kept, wondering how domestic space is working in the film. And, I love that it's, that the way the film focuses on domestic space enables you to focus in particularly on, relationships between women and a kind of multi-generational, feminine, Métis cultural space. And there's this line where I think Renée is talking to Aten and saying, my father was always out of the house and my mother was always at home, kind of alone. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about like how you're thinking of that kind of experience of movement in terms of the structure of temporality in your work, because so much of the film is within that domestic space, that kind of space of, which allows for a lot of solitude and a lot of kind of moments of reflection, but also for really vibrant kind of sociality throughout the film. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I was really just kind of struck by how much of this film occurs within domestic space and how little of it occurs kind of like out in what we'd think of as like public context. Like the restaurant that we end in is really this entry into the public world.
Yeah.
I mean, is that part of that temporality, that kind of complex temporality that you're speaking of, that domestic center, or is it?
I think so. I think it's also sort of, it's a bunch of things. Like I think I am obsessed with home and sort of ideas of home and coming back to home and like taking care of home and sort of what that means, both in sort of these physical ways, but also how to take care of various other homes through other actions. And yeah, and just kind of weird, I don't know, I think for me, it's just like the manual labor of this stuff and taking care of this house. And for some reason, when you were talking, I just was thinking about this moment I had recently where I was like washing my niece's hair. And it was like, through that and through seeing her, I like saw myself and I was my mom, you know what I mean? And sort of these interesting things that happen through touching and kind of being physical and being intimate, and kind of how that can like ignite other ways of being and other generations or dimensions or whatever you want to call it, right? And there's also this inside outside play to this idea of time that I have. Like I think to me it's very symbolic that the Métis Nation is an infinity sign, like because that, like to me, that is 100% like how I sort of see my role in kind of all the different worlds I occupy, is like this sort of always inside outside kind of movement and understanding of these various realms and colliding, opposing realms, and this weird kind of balance of all these things happening at the same time all the time. But yeah, inside, outside, and home, and taking care of home. Yeah, there's lots going on, and it's simple things too. I think that was a thing too. As soon as I like took away a lot of the dialogue, it was just like, how can we kind of convey these inner worlds through kind of taking care of this home, or just getting out of, instead of having all this stuff about Renée's past, let's just like show her getting out of her costume and, getting into a new costume, and sort of how the narrative could be kind of implied in those actions, or, those vestiges, or, this new and improved Renée. It's rambling.
No, that's, I don't know. That's, I did really love the way, like how much attention was put on tending to home, as you say, and kind of caring for home. And yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of the kind of, it's a very material relation to home that you show, and was thinking about that in terms of what you've been discussing in terms of your relation to photochemical film and analog film practices. There's a question here about that decision to work on 16 millimeter, and I think there are probably some students listening, and so I'm wondering if, like, do you encourage students to work on 16 millimeter or on photochemical film in our digital culture? And if so, why? Like, what do you feel the value is in that format choice?
Yeah, I actually do encourage it. I think especially because, like, I was sort of self-taught. I didn't go to, like, post-secondary for film. I quit architecture school and went to a film co-op, and just ended up taking all their workshops and kind of ended up in a Bolex workshop. And and that was sort of the first sort of workshop I had been in. I didn't have, didn't even have a, moving image in a digital camera. I hadn't even tried doing that. I was, like, making weird little animations through individual photographs on a digital camera, but the first, like, moving image I shot was, with a Bolex. And yeah, it was magical. Like I said, like, when I was studying architecture, I had a hard time with materiality. I couldn't really understand what that was about, or how one would go about making those decisions. And it was interesting to me to have found a materiality that was images, and kind of like how I could create things out of other images, or, just this idea of abstracting the image into materiality became, like, really interesting. And so that's how I started doing these film collage works. But I think, I learned, like, my first film was hand spliced, like, and so I think I, like, learned these things that I kind of really define what my voice is, or how I work in sort of this weird world of cinema, was, from, like, having an intimate one-to-one relationship with filmmaking. And now, I just love it. Like, to me, that, again, like, that divine relationship between light and the photochemical process and the camera, and even just, kind of sending the film away and not seeing it right away is kind of really integral, I think, to my process and how I enter dialogue with my images, So yeah, I'm always highly encourage people to try it out, but I also understand it's not for everybody. And have, like, encouraged friends to do it, and it didn't work out, and so then you feel bad, but it's okay.
You're not learning anymore.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I mean, you've talked about architecture a few times. We just have a few more minutes, but it's making me think of that shot of the burning house.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like you have a kind of ambivalent relationship to architecture. Like, there are things about it that were important to you, but other things that maybe you didn't relate to. And so, I don't know, am I reading too much into that shot of this house on fire? Is that some kind of, or I guess I'm just wondering about, like, really just the question is more about the relationship between architecture and your kind of experience with working within a kind of educational context in architecture school as well, and the different kind of spaces and structures that we encounter in this film.
Yeah, I think for sure, like, there's an obsession with deconstructing space in my work, and kind of, we're blowing it up, like, I have another film that's, like, buildings on fire. And so yeah, I think, like, this idea of home, or this idea of the shape of a home, which is, like, reoccurring in all my films, and sort of becomes this character that I, like, tear apart and put back together, and I tear it apart again and put it back together. I think that's, like, the house of the narrative in a weird way, I think, like, even when I was first approaching cinema and cinematic language, like, a lot of my first animations, I was thinking not, like, in sort of medium shots or close-ups. I was thinking sort of in the section, or, an establishing plan, or, like, I was thinking in sort of architectural drawing conventions, and sort of, so yeah, I think it's the house of the narrative. And yeah, how I always just want to tear it apart in a weird way, and kind of build anew. Yeah, I just, like, have this obsession with ruin, I guess. I don't know.
I mean, it does feel like a space that you can still kind of inhabit, you know? I mean, so it does feel like you've constructed something. It's not just this demolition act, you know?
Yeah.
This is kind of a big question, but I think it's also an important one. Someone has asked, can you talk about the sound design and the film score and how you conceived of the sonic dimension of the film?
Yeah, for sure. So I love sound, and so many times had like, I think for me, sound is like that way that it's like the sound can like really push people into these other areas that I really kind of like want to push them in. And the sound is something I kind of, yeah, meditate over it. And I always have these like weird like playlists. I listen to like so much music and I have playlists. And so I'm always sort of like trying to find the vibe or listening to something to see if it'll trigger something or, and I also came up across Rhayne Vermette, who is this fantastic artist here in Manitoba, and kind of I discovered his collage works first, and they really spoke to me. They kind of looked like something I would maybe do, and so I got curious about him, and then discovered that he was a sound artist, and he's got like such a beautiful range of like experimentation in his work. Like he'll make some really lovely sound collages that are just like pristine and beautiful and sad, and then he'll just like make something that's just like incredible and aggressive. Feels like the end of the world. So yeah, Brett came on board and we worked sort of in an unconventional way. Like he would just dump loops on me. He'd just like work on stuff, and I sort of told him, I was like, I'm thinking about trains, and I'm thinking about fire, and these are the sort of things that are happening in the film. And so he would just go and he like used to get field recordings. And we also did fiddle, and fiddling music is sort of this kind of interesting trope of the Métis Nation. So we kind of got some of that in and kind of, Brett messed with it. And I really used Brett's loops in the edit to kind of really hinge sort of the pacing of the film, and kind of, yeah, really grateful for Brett for being so generous with his loops, because it really was like the key that was missing when I was trying to edit the film before. And and then we just like in the sound design took what Brett did and just re-looped it. And so everything is always like changing again. And it's just this weird cycle that keeps happening in my work. And yeah, I don't know if things just come out of like some of my favorite things was just like, I love the scene with like the hands and the waves, and that just sort of came to me. I was like walking and I was like, oh my God, it's going to be sound of waves, and just, yeah, I feel really open to sound, and sort of working with sound is so exciting to me. And I'm not really, even when we're on set, I don't care about sync sound. Like, if we were sort of getting bogged down and trying to get sync sound and stuff, or things weren't working, it was just like, let's just focus this and we'll shoot this and I'll figure out the sound later. And kind of untethered is how I like to be, I guess. Yeah. And I think it kind of, again, when we think about time too, by like not syncing that sound with that event, you're inherently kind of implicating different kind of modes of existing in time there also.
I think we have one more minute.
Okay.
So much pressure. Maybe I'll ask you this question about, someone has asked that you mentioned a project that is on IMAX. That's something that's in the works. Yeah.
I'm collaging on IMAX films. I actually have one over here, which you can show. I just finished. It's so I'm making these weird collages with the intention of taking them to an Oxbury and kind of reanimating them on 35 and 16, and then sort of make a story from like collaging 16 into 35 into IMAX. St. Anne was kind of like a weird ride, and so I found myself just like wanting to put the music on and kind of make weird spaces. So I'm making these weird, this is supposed to be the sequel to Domus, by the way. So I'm making these weird butterfly rooms and kind of thinking about galactic histories and the word on paper and bureaucracies. So it's going to be a weird film. Yeah, I don't know what it is yet.
I'm just out of curiosity, do you have like people who you, like other animators or kind of people who work within that kind of collage cinema space who you have in mind when you're doing stuff like that? Or do you try to kind of keep that far away from you so that you can work independently?
Actually, there's this Ed Ackerman, who's this weirdo animator guy here in Winnipeg, and who I consider one of my mentors. He's just made some incredible animations, like Primiti Tuta. I think you can watch it on YouTube. It's like he would make animations with typewriters and stuff. But he made a sequel to that film, Primiti Tuta, which is called Tuta 2, and it's like he's cutting I think like 8 mil into 16 into 35, and he got these like hole punches made. And so I saw that film shortly after kind of joining a film co-op, the film group. And that was like, what, you know what I mean? That was like sort of a thing. So I always think about Ed, and Ed actually is the person who gave me these IMAX cells. So yeah, I think about that work, but I don't think anybody's doing it to the insanity that I've been sort of doing it, and the obsession about it. Yeah, I don't actively try to stay away from things, but I kind of I find if things come to me when they're meant to come to me. I'm not really somebody who actively looks for work, though.
A few more minutes, I guess, for closing thoughts. Yeah, I don't know. Were there things that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, I don't think so. I feel like I've been rambling all night. I just honestly, I don't know what I talked about.
Well, maybe I'll just. I mean, there are a few other questions in the feed, but I guess maybe the one that sticks out to me, and maybe we can close with this one, is about, I mean, you worked on St. Anne for 2 years, and someone has asked how you related to such a personal and experimental film for that kind of a duration. I'd be interested to hear whether your relationship to the project changed over the course of that time. I mean, I know that you started off with a script and very quickly got rid of the script, for instance, but just emotionally and I guess spiritually, even what your relationship to the project was like throughout that 2-year process.
Yeah, it was crazy a little bit. Yeah, I really was living with it, but I wasn't the only one. That's the thing too. It's my set designer had all this stuff, and the costumes, I held on to them. So we kind of were all in this mode of living with this project and caring for it in these weird ways, even just our good thoughts for it, that's caring for it. So yeah, it was crazy. I think overall St. Anne was about a 6-year process, because it was about 1.5 years of writing, and 2+ years of shooting, plus a year of editing, and then last year. But the film came out of my relationship with it. I didn't know what the film was going to be until it was sent off to Berlin. Even going into the edit, it could have been a bazillion different versions of itself, and that's what keeps me committed to these projects. Is it's kind of a weird mind eroticism of what is it going to be, and kind of the filmmaking is the only thing I'm really committed to, because it's just oh, this is, what is this? And it's super it kind of keeps me going. And that's why I say I'm quite selfish about where my work comes from, because it is about me kind of tittling myself and kind of understanding the world of the work and seeing it sort of become this thing. It's kind of witnessing an event, and that I get to be part of, and so yeah, it always comes out of those relationships, and they're not the easy, sometimes you feel like you're going crazy and stuff, but there always is that, that curiosity about it and wanting to see what it becomes. So that kind of always really keeps me committed to it. Yeah.
Cool. That seems like a really great place to end to me. But maybe the organizers of the festival may agree or disagree.
I don't know. I think they...
Well, I guess we can just end here. And I would just say thank you so much for being with us tonight, for sharing your work with us, and for being so kind of open and generous in your responses to all of these questions. Yeah, it's been really lovely to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, I don't know. Thank you all. Thank you so much for your time. I had a great time. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Rhayne Vermette, for joining us this evening to discuss your really remarkable debut feature film, Saint Anne. We're grateful to Josh Guilford for moderating this really fascinating conversation. And thanks to Laura McGough, curator of this season's MMFF, to Nefeli Forni-Sarapudaki, assistant curator, and to our outstanding film festival interns who will be credited at the end of the trailer that plays in a moment. And thank you, our audience. Note that Saint Anne is still available for streaming on demand via our website, so feel free to go and watch it again. I know you want to. Don't miss our next event with the selected works of Vic Quesada and our live conversation with the artist on Wednesday, April 20th. It's a pleasure for me to acknowledge and to thank our sponsors who make the 2022 MMFF possible. At UMass Amherst, that's the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, the UMass Arts Council, and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And special thanks to the 5 College Film and Media Council and the 5 College Native American and Indigenous Studies program with a grant through the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Please see our website for information about the festival, upcoming events, and to find videos of past events. That's blogs.umass.edu/MMFF2022. The Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival is presented by the Film Studies program at UMass Amherst, Barbara Zecki, Film Studies Director. I'm Daniel Pope, Director of the festival, together with Sean Shimpak. Good night.